It's the traditional day of workers' solidarity and protest around the world. And this year across the Americas, it's taken on an extra significance. So how relevant are labor organizations in the Western Hemisphere today? You're watching Inside Story from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. May the 1st is the traditional day of celebration for workers' rights. And this year it's providing an opportunity for many thousands around the world to voice their frustration at government policies they say are harming them. Workers in Europe are being particularly hit hard following crippling budget cuts by governments who claim it's the only way out of the continent's economic troubles. But this year the anger has also spread here to the United States. The Occupy Wall Street movement and other groups called for a national general strike, which would be the first the country has seen since the 1940s. Latin America is seeing huge numbers on the streets, not all in protest. In Venezuela, Hugo Chavez has announced a new law extending workers' rights as he tries to reinforce his support among his base. Perhaps nowhere in the region is the issue more pertinent than in Colombia, where a recent free trade deal signed with the US has raised serious concerns about the country's record on anti-union violence. Earlier, I spoke to the Vice President of Colombia, Angelino Gazon, himself a former union leader who's also a candidate for director of the International Labour Organization. I asked him if Colombia had got away without meeting its obligations to protect union workers.
The
free trade agreement that was signed between Colombia and the United States is a voluntary agreement between two equal countries. It's a commercial agreement that favors both communities, both countries, and the economy in Colombia. Colombia has been asked to also sign a specific clause that talks about human rights and rights for unions and workers. Investors in the American society and the American government can monitor the development of human rights in the same way the Colombian government and Congress can ask the United States to respect the rights of its workers.
Right, but there's no conditionality. The number of union activists being killed could increase this year, but the free trade agreement will continue. There's no leverage anymore. There's no pressure. The pressure is off.
No, al contrario, Colombia es un país en progreso.
It's the opposite. Colombia is a country that is progressing. It's an example to everyone else. We have lived through 62 years of violence, and we have good labor conditions now. We are asking for all the rights of all political activists and religious workers to be respected. We have developed an economy respecting human rights and giving more democracy to the country and growing in social and economic terms. We are steadfast in our policy to fully respect the human rights and defending human rights in society. We are protecting the activities of union leaders and all of the human rights activists in politics. So we will reduce the violence against unions and people that work for unions. We are trying to consolidate Colombia as a country that gives democracy and protects human rights.
Can you see why some feel it's strange that the vice president of a country that leads the world in the killing of trade union activists should be running to become Director General of the International Labour Organization?
Bueno, en el país no existe ninguna violencia institucional contra los trabajadores.
In this country, there is no institutional violence against workers. We protect workers and we protect people who own companies. We protect unions and all the workers and the institutions of democracy. And we give people the right to get into unions and organize collectively. When the president presented my candidacy, he was trying to send a message to the international community that we're taking a stand in Colombia, trying to respect human rights and industry. Obviously, because of my experience and knowledge, I am capable of running the ILO. I was a union leader for 22 years, and now I have responsibilities in the government. So I can deal with both local and international issues. I know the world of workers, and I know the people who run the companies.
So, are labour interests losing out to corporate needs in the Western Hemisphere? With me in the studio to discuss this is Adrienne Pine, Professor of Anthropology at American University. Next to her, Cathy Feingold from the AFL-CIO, the umbrella group for US unions. And from Bogota, Colombia, Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli from the Washington office on Latin America. Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli, first of all then, the Vice President very much brushing off any concerns over the repression of trade unionists and workers. Do you accept his account?
Completely, I do not accept his accounts. Basically, Colombia is embroiled in internal armed conflict, which is far from over. If you just see the number of FARC attacks that have taken place in recent weeks, that gives you an example of what's going on, as well as the mass displacements. In terms of labor, what Colombia has done is change the rhetoric from former President Álvaro Uribe. They don't attack trade unionists, accuse them of being terrorists anymore. They say wonderful things about them. However, what they say and what is actually happening in the ground is completely contradictory. We've seen since the Labor Action Plan was signed between Obama and Santos, which was supposed to be a precursor before advancing with the FTA, that over 500 death threats were sent to trade unionists. We've had basically 29 trade unionists killed, including one last Friday, of the priority sugar sector of the Labor Action Plan, where the U.S. had been heavily involved in trying to change things. We see only that 3.5% of the labor force in Colombia is able to unionize because there are very strong obstacles, aside from violence, to unionization, including this third-party model called the cooperatives. We are seeing a tremendous amount of anger among the different labor movements. Today, there was a mass march here in Bogota of hundreds of workers from all around the country saying that they're incredibly concerned because they don't have labor stability. Their labor conditions are basically going down, and that with the FTA now, this is going to get worse.
Right, and just to explain, FTA, of course, meaning the free trade agreement, or the so-called free trade agreement. It might not be a bad idea then to remind us of some of the pretty grim figures as regards the repression of trade unionists. The National Labour School reports that Colombia is the most dangerous country in the world to be a trade unionist. Nearly 3,000 trade union members have been killed since 1986. Only 5% of union killings in Colombia have ever led to a conviction. In 2010, there were 51 murders of unionists. In 2011, there were 30 killings. None were successfully prosecuted. At least 4 union members have already been killed this year. If that assassination rate continues, Colombia will retain the title of most dangerous country for unionists. Also, Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli there mentioned this Labor Action Plan, which was supposed to have been signed in to go hand in hand with the Colombia Free Trade Agreement with the US. That's intended to promote fair labor practices and protect union workers in Colombia. Some of the provisions it lists include expanding the government protection program for union leaders and increasing criminal penalties for employers who threaten union workers. But labor activists have criticized the plan. The White House refused to grant guarantees, such as a 3-year period with no killings of union workers, or a mechanism voiding the trade agreement if the murders rise again. I mean, what do we to make of this, and Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli? First of all, who is now responsible for these killings? Help put that into context for us. You mentioned in the past we now have documented cases of state agencies actively colluding in the deaths of trade unionists, but who is now responsible?
Yes. Well, the majority of the killings are perpetrated by paramilitaries or by illegal armed persons like sicarios and so forth, close to a lot of these corporate interests. And some of them are the Águilas Negras, some of them are the Urabeños. They have different names. There are approximately 7 different groupings now of regrouped successor paramilitary groups from the AUC.
But when you say corporate interests specifically, do you mean, those corporate interests who have the most to gain from the free trade agreement that's just been signed?
Yes. Yes, basically the free trade agreement, what it will do is give a big reward to several of the sectors in Colombia, including biofuels, mining, and oil palm cultivation that have been heavily permeated by serious issues of criminal activity. For example, in the Chocó, you have 13 palm industrialists being investigated by the Attorney General's office for links to paramilitaries and for having caused the displacement of people to their lands. You still have the whole banana industry seriously questioned because of their links to paramilitaries, and even the U.S. Treasury fined them for such activity in the past. So What I'm saying is that Colombia is in a state of conflict. Colombia continues to have very heavy structures of paramilitaries that continue to operate, as well as it continues to have a major internal armed conflict with two guerrilla groups that, while they've been significantly weakened, mostly due to U.S. assistance in the military sphere, are still very much a threat to democracy in this country. And so what the United States wants to do is deepen our economic relationship with this terrible situation.
That's the point, Cathy Feingold. President Obama, he once opposed free trade agreements, such as this particular one, in fact, but he signed it. He went through with it. What does that suggest about President Obama and this administration, then?
Well, I think there was a real political mandate for President Obama to sign this, despite the fact that he knew there had not been the advancements that we needed to see. The labor movement, working with organizations like WOLA, has repeatedly sent letters, spoken to the administration directly about the fact that now was not the time to sign the trade agreement until we could see some real advancements. And again, we have seen in the past year, since it was the Labor Action Plan came into force, it's been about a year now, we've seen increase in threats. Someone was just killed last week. So we've lost most of the leverage to really improve the human rights situation in Colombia.
Professor Pine, I mean, let's widen this out to the rest of Latin America. How much does this then chime in with the Obama administration's concerns generally in Latin America for workers' rights and trade unions and so forth?
Well, I think what we've seen throughout Latin America is a real disappointment in Obama's policies towards workers in countries throughout the hemisphere. I specialize in Honduras, where the Obama administration supported through its actions a military coup that took place in 2009, and that's been devastating for union workers and union leaders. There have been a vast increase in the number of union leaders killed, and many of them are engaged in struggles to protect the public institutions of that country.
But what's the U.S. response then? What's the Obama administration response when these the killings of union workers and indeed just normal workers anyway is brought up by you and other organizations?
You know, it's been deafeningly silent. There was a letter recently from 94 congresspeople of Jen Schakowsky noting this violence, and the AFL-CIO has also been involved in bringing to the State Department's attention this level of violence against union leaders and other people who oppose the coup. And the State Department has really brushed it off and has used the rhetoric of human rights very much in the way that the Vice President of Colombia used the rhetoric of human rights in order to help us not see the real issue here, which is that with free trade agreements, capital has free movement across borders, whereas people don't, and so they're at a disadvantage.
Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli, I mean, that's the point then. Clearly this administration is wedded to free trade agreements like this. Again, so-called free trade, perhaps trade agreements is more accurate. What does that suggest? I mean, who will be helped by agreements like this? What do you think will be the effect of this FTA in Colombia, for example, and what knock-on effects might there be for the rest of Latin America?
Well, I think it's going to have devastating effects in Colombia. The free trade agreement is benefiting multinationals, basically. I don't even think it's benefiting the Colombian government well enough, because the amount of taxation that they will receive from these multinationals will be minimal. So in a sense, it's lessening the sovereignty of the country. But worse than that, most of the sectors, the areas of the country where the extractive industries that are going to be benefited and so forth will take place are areas where Afro-Colombian and indigenous people live. And in Colombia, you have a situation where it's the largest displacement population in the world, 5.5 million. It's completely invisible, unfortunately. However, most of this displacement, a lot of it is tied to violence linked to large-scale economic projects, illegal appropriation of lands, paramilitaries taking people out of areas so that businesses can come in and operate in those areas. So we're horrified by this. We're very concerned that the Obama administration, despite the repeated efforts on our part to bring the voices of Afro-Colombian and indigenous people's concerns, including an indigenous population where 34 groups are about to become culturally and physically extinct due to this situation, did not take any measures to protect the rights of these people so that the effects of this free trade agreement is not going to be even worse than what we've seen in other trade agreements.
What recourse do workers have then, Professor Pine, as we look at the state of unionism around Latin America? I mean, it's quite mystifying sometimes for an outsider, especially, to look at the different unions that we see from Mexico down to South America. Some appear to be genuinely fighting for workers' rights. Others seem to be utterly sham union organizations set up by corporations sometimes and so forth. I mean, how does it all fit together, and how does it work?
Well, it's a very complex picture indeed. As you mentioned, there are certainly sham organizations set up and used to infiltrate or to damage the unions that are really fighting. But one thing that we can talk about on May Day, International Workers' Day, is that we do see massive numbers of people going out into the streets and demanding a different kind of model, one that isn't premised on the democracy of corporations, but rather the voice.
The race to the bottom. I mean, appealing to shareholders rather than interests, rather than the workers' interests, I suppose.
Exactly.
But I mean, are there alternative? Yeah. I mean, are there any positive examples? I know, Cathy Feingold, you're doing a lot of work in Brazil. Are there maybe models there that may be gaining strength, that may be more influential in Latin America in the future?
Absolutely. I think the Americas provide some of these alternative models as we're seeing challenges in Europe and around the world. I think countries like Brazil, for example, that have spent, in a moment where lots of countries are pivoting towards austerity and cutting back in social programs, Brazil has been spending, has been creating jobs, has supported unions and discussions when...
the argument is that unionization and workers' rights will turn off multinationals. Is there any evidence that is actually happening in Brazil then?
Absolutely not. I think Brazil is a strongly unionized workforce, is growing, strong social protections, lifting people out of poverty, and unions can be a response to helping workers get greater wage shares.
I mean, I know your department in particular, then, with the AFL-CIO, is the international department. You're forging these links. It's strange because clearly, then, when we're negotiating perhaps more with multinationals than we are with state actors now for workers' rights and so forth, it's very easy for different working populations to be played off against each other. In fact, sometimes even in the rhetoric from American unions, they talk about it's sort of them or us. I mean, it's the Mexican workers who are going to do really well, supposedly, from NAFTA, which again is very controversial, and it's at the expense of U.S. workers. And this is the way that things are framed. I mean, doesn't there then have to be a slightly different framework on the part of unions as well, so that they're not played off against each other?
Absolutely, and I think that's old rhetoric, I would say. Today, we absolutely approach the worker rights issues globally as a global issue. The U.S. labor movement works closely with our counterparts to help strengthen the independent workers movement in Mexico, because there are many, what we call not just sham unions, protection contracts. And we've heard in the headlines recently of corporations and corruption scandals in Mexico. Many of them have these protection contracts.
So what do you mean by that?
They go into a country, they want to go in, and the corrupt union says, here, you pay us this much money, we'll make sure the workers, get low wages, few benefits, and few protections. We'll keep them under control. Anyone speaks out to organize and express their rights, they're fired.
And so, for example, in a free trade agreement like the one with Colombia, are there any requirements for multinationals not to be dealing with sham organizations that might be actually breaking international law on union organizing and so forth?
Absolutely. They're not to engage in corruption. And the country itself, under these trade agreements, NAFTA and then the Central American DR trade agreement, there are labor chapters that require those countries to uphold and implement the ILO core principles.
But Professor Pine, I mean, are these principles being upheld? Is it realistic then to think that there might be a way to have a sort of global system of collective bargaining, perhaps, rather than looking at individual countries who are, let's face it, where individual unions are struggling, frankly, against the tide of multinational power?
Well, yeah, certainly I think that it's very important for us to have a unity that crosses borders, in the way that, capital can cross borders and has such an advantage over human beings, right, these corporations. And that's one of the things that I think is exciting about what has been happening to May Day since 2005, 2006, when it was, May Day, of course, is originally really an immigrant labor day. It was all German immigrants who were the martyrs at Haymarket. And today, and in 2005, we saw a real resurgence
here in the U.S.
In the United States. Yeah, of course, it's an international holiday right. all around the world, except in the United States.
In fact, President Obama, I mean, he did have another opportunity, I suppose, to link Labour to May the 1st in the US, but instead actually he's declared with Congress May the 1st as Loyalty Day to the flag. It was an announcement just a few hours ago. He's really not keen on the idea of workers' rights and May Day being...
No, and you know, and I think that that's one of the things that's so exciting about May Days, that despite these kinds of efforts to silence the voices of labor and immigrants together who are in this common struggle and overlapping struggle, that this May Day is having a resurgence in the United States, and that's very important symbolically and can help us to think about ways to have solidarity across borders.
But Cathy Feingold, I mean, there are various protests planned and are happening right now, in fact, as we speak, across the US. A general strike was called. The union's very much part of that, and yet, I mean, there is that fear amongst some of those groups like Occupy Wall Street, some of these immigrant groups, is that the unions, because they're so close to the Democrats and President Obama, and you know, you've endorsed President Obama, I believe, that's part of the problem. And the unions have a very difficult relationship then in some ways, on the one hand, by suggesting we need a whole new global framework for union rights and so forth, and on the other hand, basically bankrolling President Obama, who's doing very little, at least from the testimony we've heard today, to help international labor rights.
Well, I mean, I would say that the U.S. labor movement on a date like May 1st works closely with local worker center, immigrant rights groups, and so that's a key part of our work here in the United States. And I would say today there's marches that the Occupy Wall Street movement is organizing, and this is key in our country, that they are demanding, trying to hold corporations accountable here and globally, and U.S. labor is right there with them. I mean, we are, you know, locking hand in hand, participating in the protests today all through the country. With a view to what? With a view to,
so, I mean, I've actually seen, certainly the Service Employers Union have taken that 99% slogan there and use it though as a sort of rallying call to vote for President Obama, for example. I mean, doesn't that lessen the...
It's definitely much broader than that. I think the agenda is, one, when we're talking about things like trade agreements, holding corporations accountable. Working families have had to pay with their homes, with their bank accounts, with their retirement savings. And so more than thinking about this just through the political lens, I think what unions and their partners for the Occupy Wall Street, immigrant rights organizations, they want to hold corporations accountable. And that's really the message that I think they're saying today. We want strong worker rights protections, decent jobs here, and we want to make sure that this is not just about corporation rights, but it's about the rights of workers.
Professor Pine, what's your sense then?
And in Colombia,
oh, go ahead, yes.
If I can add, in Colombia, in the march today, this is basically a march for survival, because trade unionists are becoming an extinct group of people because of the proliferation of these third-party contracting systems, which are basically the only way that people can get employed. All the impediments are put in place so people can't unionize. And so while in other countries we are talking about actual celebration of people who are unionized, here in Colombia we're talking about people who just 1 or 2 months ago, you know, Cinta Masivo, they were asking to unionize so that they could have bathroom breaks, so that they could just wear a heavier jacket in the bus and not have to sit on their bus and work for 12 hours without even standing up. And what happens? Their president is killed. And unionization of that union, the membership goes completely down. So I think it's important that people understand that the situation in Colombia is not the general labor issues that you see everywhere else, but this is a situation of life and death for a lot of people.
And Professor, how do you see then the trajectory right now? Of course, in the US we have this unprecedented, rather organized attack on collective bargaining, for example, and union membership. Is that going to continue? Are there real challenges in the way? How does that connect to what we're seeing in Colombia and elsewhere, would you say?
Well, it connects. I think what Gimena is saying is really important because it's the same processes that we're seeing in the United States, which of course we're helping to export, so that we have our National Labor Relations Board, our NLRB here, that is completely dominated by a corporate agenda, Republican agenda, but Obama has not stood up to the NLRB as it's made it increasingly difficult for people to unionize, to organize, and to defend basic human rights in the workplace.
So what are the tactics? What room for hope would you have there that things
Well, I mean, I think that we need to be really creative, as capital has been creative in this neoliberal era in flexibilizing increasingly. And also, of course, we've seen the militarization as is clear in Colombia, but is also coming home as well. I think we need to be thinking not just about the traditional organizing in the traditional labor sectors within the United States, but looking at sectors that are really the flexible or the precarious various labor sectors, we need to be thinking more about this cross-border organizing and really tying in immigrant rights, since so many of our laborers and taxpayers are immigrants in the United States, and being creative and perhaps sometimes challenging the structure that we have, because that structure.
But isn't part of that structure, forgive me, Cathy Feingold, is the AFL-CIO there, isn't it? I mean, shouldn't they perhaps be a bit more selective about their endorsements for President Obama after everything you've all just said to me over the last 23 minutes, perhaps?
I mean, I definitely think that, you know, in our country, our focus right now is to mobilize the basis for changes in this country. Whether it's holding corporations accountable, our agenda is huge.
Or President Obama accountable.
And hold the president, absolutely hold president and the people that we vote for and that we're going to put into office. And that is the goal. You're going to see throughout all of the states that labor is gearing up to push back, whether it's around the attacks on immigrant rights, on collective bargaining. Labor will be there working with community partnerships. And that's really what this electoral season is going to be about.
Cathy Feingold, thank you very much. Professor Adrienne Pine, thank you. Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli, thank you very much from Bogota.
Thank you very much.
That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.